and thank you for joining Region 3 EHP's webinar series. This module will be covering the adverse effect process under the National Historic Preservation Act. My name is Arielle Harris, and I'm an Environmental Protection Specialist with Region 3. I've been working at FEMA since 2018. To refresh your memory, the Section 106 process is triggered by the federal funding of projects, or what we call undertakings. FEMA-funded undertakings must be reviewed by qualified EHP staff to assess effects to historic and archaeological resources. We do this by identifying the area of potential effects, or APE, of the undertaking, identifying historic resources within it, analyzing whether the proposed scope of work will affect any historic resources in the APE, and if there will be historic resources affected, determine whether or not the effect is adverse. These correspond to steps 1 through 3 in this flowchart. This presentation will expand on the process if an adverse effect to historic properties is found, and how to identify and resolve them. FEMA Region 3 EHP identifies and resolves adverse effects through a number of methods, which we'll describe in greater detail in this presentation, and which correspond to steps 3 and 4 in the flowchart. As a reminder, if you need a refresher on the National Historic Preservation Act, please see our other recorded module on this law. To begin, we'll cover the definition of an adverse effect. According to the National Historic Preservation Act, an adverse effect is found when an undertaking may alter, directly or indirectly, any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify the property for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. Being listed in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places can be determined in several ways. Each state historic preservation office, or SHPO, maintains an inventory of listed and or eligible National Register listed resources. If a building is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, that is typically noted in a state's database. However, it is also FEMA's obligation to assess the National Register eligibility of facilities seeking funding through FEMA undertakings based on the register's criteria for designation. For an overview of eligibility criteria under the National Register of Historic Places, I recommend consulting the National Historic Preservation Act module of this webinar. Adverse effects on historic properties include, but are not limited to, the following scope of work examples. This language is taken directly from the National Historic Preservation Act. If this looks overwhelming, don't fret. Our next slide goes into specific examples of FEMA projects that may lead to an adverse effect determination. We have found the following types of projects to be the most common to result in an adverse effect to historic properties. This does not mean that all, or even a majority of these types of projects are guaranteed to result in an adverse effect determination by Region 3 EHP. As a reminder, only if the building or facility is already listed in the National Register of Historic Places or has been determined to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places would an adverse effect determination occur. An acquisition demolition would be considered an adverse effect because the demolition of the facility would cause the resource to no longer exist. Similarly, projects such as building elevations or non-in-kind replacements of building materials, such as character-defining features of a streetscape like paving materials, would constitute an adverse effect because in the case of the elevation, the design of the proposed elevation didn't take into account the use of historically sensitive materials. Similarly, a historic district with brick paved sidewalks that proposes to replace them with concrete sidewalks would be considered an adverse effect. In addition, utility or equipment hookups that destroy historic building materials by drilling into brick or stone, or cause a visual obtrusion or obstruction to the building or a surrounding historic district may also be considered an adverse effect to a historic property. And finally, it is important to remember that historic resources may lay directly under our feet. If ground disturbance occurs in an area with potential for archaeological discovery without the appropriate monitoring, that could also be considered an adverse effect. So, what are the steps to follow when a FEMA EHP reviewer finds that the proposed scope of work of a project may constitute an adverse effect? This abridged flowchart shows what a typical adverse effect resolution looks like, and we'll go over all of these steps in detail. When an adverse effect to a historic property is detected by FEMA, the first thing FEMA Region 3 EHP staff does is inform program and the applicant, and we will likely schedule an informal meeting. During this meeting, EHP staff will explain why the project as written constitutes an adverse effect. We then have the opportunity to work together with the applicant to potentially change the scope of work to avoid or minimize the adverse effect, or determine if the subdivision of the project is appropriate and feasible. For instance, if a project has multiple components written to it and only one of which is an adverse effect, it may be possible to separate the components of the project which do not comprise an adverse effect from the one which does. If a solution to avoid or minimize the adverse effect can be reached this way, the scope of work can be formalized with these changes and SHPO notified of the work. Through this method, it is most likely that the adverse effect would be avoided altogether. If the scope of work cannot be changed and the adverse effect is unavoidable, we will explain next steps in the Section 106 process to the applicant and solicit requests for potential treatment measures. Ultimately, avoidance and minimization measures, whether in the scope of work upfront or determined during project review, help move projects forward. The chart in front of you is the same adverse effect resolution chart from an earlier slide, but on the left, it shows the reduced steps needed if an adverse effect can be minimized or avoided through changes in the scope of work. When an applicant chooses to move forward with a project despite an adverse effect determination, FEMA has several tools in place to propose to SHPO in order to mitigate the adverse effect. The first are standard treatment measures according to our statewide programmatic agreements. Since the SHPOs are signatories on the programmatic agreements, these are somewhat pre-approved and can include measures such as photographic documentation, surveys, public interpretation, historic context narratives, oral histories, and more. If standard treatment measures cannot apply to mitigate an adverse effect, the next route to take would be to draft a Memorandum of Agreement, or MOA. MOAs are agreement documents between FEMA, the applicant, and local consulting parties consisting of stakeholders interested in the site. MOAs may include more non-conventional treatment measures, including architectural salvage, or more complex public interpretation. Finally, the most complex type of mitigation agreement would be a secondary programmatic agreement. These are typically related to a specific type of undertaking or an addendum to a larger programmatic agreement, and are therefore less common. It is important to note that any funding needed to accomplish these mitigation measures, whether part of the programmatic agreement or in a memorandum of agreement, would have to come out of the overall project budget. Therefore, it is important to set a budget aside for these types of costs. As previously noted, FEMA will notify SHPO of the project and our determination of effect after notifying the applicant and working through avoidance or minimization measures with them. Avoidance measures that change the initial scope of work will more than likely lead to a no adverse effect determination. If an adverse effect determination is unavoidable, then FEMA will propose treatment measures or invite SHPO to participate in an MOA or secondary programmatic agreement. Upon completion of SHPO and, when applicable, tribal consultation, FEMA EHP will notify the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation of the adverse effect as required under law. Ultimately, an adverse effect is resolved when the negotiated treatment measures, either through standard treatment measures or an MOA, are completed. However, FEMA may complete the EHP review of the project prior to the resolution of the adverse effect. The Record of Environmental Consideration, or REC, issued by EHP for the project will note the adverse effect determination and document what types of treatment measures or MOAs were negotiated. It is FEMA's responsibility to follow up with the applicant and any consulting parties to ensure that the resolution of the adverse effect remains on time, funded, and fully completed within the period of performance of the federal grant. And with that, our module is complete. I'd like to thank you for joining me for this discussion of adverse effect projects and hope that these explanations make your project planning and execution a little bit easier.